Hello, and thank you so much for joining us for Coffee and Conversation. Today we have Associate Pastor John with us, who is going to take part in our Coffee and Conversation today. So it's going to be a little different. Thank you so much, Pastor John, for joining us today. So I'm going to just dive down into it.
Okay.
So Pastor Jeff's sermon on Sunday talked about carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders, and how we should probably not do that because God is there for us to help us and help relieve some of that from us, some of that weight from us. So what are some ways that we can take that weight and that stress off of our shoulders? Because it's really hard to do.
Sure. So I think one of the first things that often comes to mind is doing prayer. I think that's great.
Yeah.
But that can be a little bit abstract or maybe a little bit too general. So I think drilling down into that a little bit is helpful. Yeah. So within the space of using prayer as kind of a tool or a kind of way to try to find some peace, find some coming to terms with hard things, challenges in life and stuff like that, I would just say two things. I would say, one, it's really, really important to find a prayer time and a kind of prayer discipline that works for you.
Okay.
I don't think it has to be any one thing. Sometimes there are prescriptions over prayer has to be done this way, or it has to be done at this time of day, it has to be done in this number of ways. I'm a big fan of pragmatism when it comes to prayer because from my standpoint, just in my own experience and work and talking to other people and things like that, what seems to be really, really important is finding a type of prayer that we can do consistently.
Okay.
Because that kind of connection, that kind of being able to feel close to God and feel in sync and in communion with God seems to have a lot to do with being able to just have a disciplined form of prayer. And if we kind of try to follow a prescription that doesn't work for us, then we start to feel guilty or ashamed, we're not doing a thing and things like that. I recall my college roommate and I, at one point, we decided we were going to get up every day at 6 a.m. and pray for 30 minutes a day. I stopped after a week because I'm not a morning person. He continued through the semester, but he was very tired and he was very kind of haggard, and it was not a kind of generative experience. So I would say that when it comes to kind of tips or tactics or things along those lines for finding ways to connect and finding meaningful ways to lift the burden or ease the burden in the context of prayer and using prayer for that, I would say first find a type of prayer that works for you. Okay. It might be 5 minutes a day, it might be 5 minutes every other day, it might be an hour some point in the week. We all have different schedules, we have different lives, where some of us are morning people, some of us are evening people. But I think the big thing is finding a type of practice where you can reflect and connect. Okay. And then finding a way to do that consistently. So I would say developing that and making it a discipline, because it's just really important to be able to get into that space and get into that time and to do so with some consistency. And then within that space, in terms of thinking about types of prayer, I think sometimes this can be a kind of hard to know what type of prayer to do or things like that. I don't know. Do you have a preferred type of prayer that you like to do?
So when I pray, I have kind of like what you said. I have my routine. I have my space. Mm-hmm. So I have actually an area in my room where I am free of distraction. I go in, I pray, and for me, prayer is more of a conversation to God. So I say my routine prayers in the morning before I go to bed, but when I'm really trying to connect with God, or I'm trying to relieve some of that weight that I carry on my shoulders, for me, it's more of a conversation. So I'm just talking to God. Sometimes I'm writing too, prayer journaling mm-hmm. is really important to me mm-hmm. and a good way for me to get my thoughts out. So that's what I do. And it's more, like I said, a conversation. I'm just talking to him God, this is what I need from you. Help me. And sometimes he shows me in ways that I'm oh, you've shown me this, mm-hmm. I'm asking for patience and you're testing my patience. So you're giving me opportunities to practice that patience. So by being tested. So I see that, and sometimes I don't even see that he's answering prayers until I'm having that conversation also in oh yes, I prayed for this, and now I see that this was an opportunity for me to be patient, and maybe I failed that opportunity, or maybe I did great on it. So yeah, that's kind of what I do.
Thank you for sharing that. And I would say, I would kind of just add on to that. I think it's really helpful to just ask people what works for them, because again, prayer is this kind of, I mean, we have written prayers and we have types of prayer and we have kind of liturgy around this and law and 2,000 years of tradition, and we have prayers in the Bible and these kinds of things. But when it comes to kind of where the rubber meets the road and finding practices of prayer that work, I have found it just super helpful to ask somebody like, what do you do? What works for you? So I appreciate that.
Yeah,
I appreciate
absolutely.
that, and that to me is one of the fastest ways to sort of scale up or kind of just find something that can work, because you can ask someone, hey, what do you do? You can try it, and then maybe it'll work. If it does, awesome. And then if it doesn't, you can move on and ask somebody else and try something new. But I think the big thing is just continuing to like talk and converse and connect with other people in the church community.
Yeah.
And you'll often find, or I have often found, that people have approaches to prayer that I haven't even thought of, and that seem to open up new ways to connect. So
Perfect.
yeah.
Awesome. So we're talking about lifting the weight of the world off of our shoulders, and we do that through prayer, which is super important. So what are some of the things that we should lift up to God?
Right. So I think I'm a big fan of, well, we could say everything, but that's maybe too generic for what we're trying to do. So I think in the context of how I understand that question, or maybe the way just I'll take that question, is I would say anything that is sort of causing fear, anxiety, doubt, frustration. So it might be pain, it might be a type of situation that's challenging, it might just be it might be like a situation itself, or that's causing problems, or it could just be a kind of internal state that we carry a lot. But I would just say anything that brings us into spaces of kind of trouble are worth bringing to prayer.
Okay.
And bringing into that space. And I would add, I don't think you have to abandon, like you don't have to abandon feeling frustrated or feeling doubt or feeling those kind of things. And we can maybe unpack that a little bit later, or I guess just in a couple minutes here. But I would say, if you bring those things into the space of prayer, that doesn't mean you have to relinquish them, and it doesn't mean they immediately evaporate or they just go away.
Right.
Especially like if we're in a recurring situation that's challenging, like maybe we have a coworker or or a boss or things like that, where we're kind of running into conflict over and over, or we have financial troubles. I mean, there are sort of any number of things that can cause recurring problems and challenges. So that it doesn't necessarily just dissipate and it doesn't necessarily go away. But I think anything that is sort of causing those troubled or difficult states are worth bringing to prayer. I mean, I think we could say everything is worth bringing to prayer, but definitely those would be good places to start.
So that was kind of what I was thinking too, is like everything is worth praying about. Everything is worth trying to release that stress up to God and lift that stress up to God. And he tells us to do that, which is one of the other questions. The last question that was asked today was, is there anything that we shouldn't lift up to God? And like my thought on that is, like you said, everything can be lifted up to God. What do you think?
It's a good question. I think everything can be lifted up. I think everything is worthy of that. The only thing I'll say, and I'll try to answer this very carefully, I would say that in the context of prayer and in the context of negotiating challenges, whether it's in life or whether it's internal to ourselves, that I wouldn't necessarily surrender the right to feel frustrated or to wrestle with anxiety or uncertainty or things like that. And I'll just say a little bit more about that. Sometimes when we have these conversations, or I've listened to many sermons, I've talked to people, read books and things like that. And what I found is that sometimes in the conversations around difficulty and trouble and pain is that there's a kind of almost kind of a prohibition of being able to have those feelings or have those emotions, or to have that space. Or maybe you can have them for a little while, but if you have them for an extended amount of time, then like that's not good, and it's not optimal. That's not what we want. But I would say that there's far more room to run in that space than we typically allow. And I would point to scripture in order to sort of make this case, because one of these things, sometimes we when we think about God and we think about prayer and we think about our relationship, we think about it in a kind of one-way street where God demands all praise, and that's what we do, and that's how it works. But that's not really the model that we get when we're looking at either the Old Testament or the New Testament. And what we find when we dig into the models used to describe God's relationship to us, it really is a two-way street. And even the idea of covenant is sort of an ancient form of a contract, where there is a kind of reciprocal relationship where we do have duties and obligations in ways that we connect to God, but that runs the other way as well. That God is looking out for us, that God is protecting us, and these kinds of things. And so what we see in the Old Testament and the New Testament is that when things start to get hard, when things start to get challenging, people have problems, they have complaints, they have frustrations, and they will bring those to God. And it's actually part of the expected discourse. It's part of the relationship. And so whether it's Abraham negotiating with God over the potential destruction of a city, whether it's the psalmists crying out in lamentation over the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, over exile, whether it's the book of Job itself, which is the whole thing. Sometimes people say Job never complained. That's not right. Job complained a lot. The context there is that Job didn't sin in the context of his frustration. But Job was super frustrated, and it makes complete sense because a lot of bad things happened to Job.
Right.
And so the entire book of Job is really built around that understanding of the relationship where it is a two-way street. And Job isn't condemned for bringing sort of lodging complaints or lodging frustration. That's not really where the whole thing ends. So I would say, and then even if we fast forward to Gethsemane, we have Jesus wrestling with his own fate, and of course, like there's an acceptance there, but this idea that we can't have anxiety, we can't have frustration, we can't have doubt, that we can't or we shouldn't have these negative experiences, these negative states, these negative emotions, or that we should only have them for maybe 5 minutes or maybe a week. I would say that we can live in that space, and we can give ourselves permission to live in that space. And I think there's a lot of scriptural warrant there. And I think if we don't, it can lend itself to resentment, to frustration. So we need to give ourselves permission to work with those emotions, to work through those things in prayer. And it could take 6 months, it could take 2 years. It's very, like, life is hard, life is challenging. And so giving ourselves permission to work through those things, I think, is really important, because again, we want to have a dynamic, vibrant connection with God, and if we kind of don't let ourselves express those feelings, express those frustrations, we can tip into resentment, we can tip into frustration, and so I would just say that we can give all things up, but we don't have to abandon having frustrated experiences or things like that. Those are things we can work on over time in prayer.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming in and talking to us today and answering our questions. So we'll have to do this more often. We have Pastor Jeff in every week. We'll have to get Pastor John in too. Thank you so much for joining us for Coffee and Conversation. We will be back next week with Pastor Jeff for another Coffee and Conversation. We'll see you then. Bye, y'all.